Cuba, New Year's Day, 1959, Havana. Batista's reign is over. Fidel Castro, Che Guevara, and their 26th July Army have overthrown the government. It is the dawn of a new age for the Cuban people and their small island. Who is Castro, and what are his most prominent features?
He was a handsome young dapper guy in camouflage. He looked fantastic. He was a great media guy. He knew how to use the media. He shamed the United States in front of the United Nations. He's a blowhard. The guy can talk until he's dead. I mean, he's just a fantastic orator. He can't do it anymore because he's ill, and he's not the strapping figure that he once was. But I think he's one of the most powerful political figures of the 20th century, And he assassinated his opposition, like most dictatorships do. So, I mean, it was I shouldn't use that word, it was brutal. Brutal.
Fidel Castro's new regime starts off with repossession. American and British farms, oil refineries, casinos, and factories are taken for the Cuban people, and American and British people are put out of jobs. 70% of land owned by non-Cubans was taken redistributed to the people. However, the government kept some of this land, withholding it from the rest of Cuba. The people of Cuba were put on the new land, some using the land for growing sugar, some using it as their new housing provided by the communist government. Accompanying the land reform were two other reforms: education and healthcare. Before the revolution's win, illiteracy rates in Cuba were up to 40% because of the high price of education. Teenagers were trained to read and then sent through the lower grades, teaching those who would learn the fastest, who also went off to teach their grandparents and parents. Within a year, the illiteracy rate was abolished. The healthcare reform also provided the people of Cuba with free healthcare, as well as access to more advanced medicine. These costs, however, were also absorbed into the government, which added to paying for houses, schools, and farms. Under the new law, almost all of the country's finances were absorbed into the government. When Castro came into power, many of the educated left the island, playing with Batista. This included economists, which were crucial to keeping the budget intact, while all these new costs were added. This left Castro open and confused, which led to an economic crash only a few years into his reign. The people's minds were starting to change about his leadership, and he developed enemies. Many of these enemies resided within the United States, and among them were numerous exiles from Cuba. The CIA recruited many exiles from their haven of Miami to be trained in Guatemala. These insurgents were named Brigade 2506 after the training number of the first casualty during training. On April 15, 1961, 8 B-26 bombers painted to look like Cuban planes left Nicaragua to bomb Cuban airfields. The bombing was not effective, and while a second bombing had been planned, it had to be canceled as word had gotten out of the U.S.'s involvement. On April 17, Brigade 2506 landed at the Bay of Pigs. The brigade was met immediately with heavy resistance from Cuban forces, and over the next 24 hours, Castro had ordered 20,000 troops to advance to the bay. On April 19th, the invasion was over, and 1,200 of the original 1,300 men of Brigade 2506 had been captured. These men would languish in Cuban prison for 20 months until their ransom of $53 million in food and medicine was paid. This invasion was to be the final straw between America and Cuba.
Weird scenes inside the gold.
How did Castro feel when the world discovered Soviet arms in Cuba?
Made it feel powerful. Very powerful. I mean, there were Soviet arms aimed at the United States, which had been created as the great enemy of the hemisphere. Pretty darn good.
While Castro was making enemies, he was also making allies. On the other side of the world was the Soviet Union, another communist regime. And Castro had reached out to them. Using their help, he used their economists to attempt to pull his country back together, but under several conditions. The Soviets foresaw Cuba as a potential political and military stronghold in the Western Hemisphere. The Soviet Union wished to protect the source of wealth, not only for economic reasons, but also for its geographical position, as the USSR's main enemy during the Cold War was the United States, a country which was able to enjoy the benefits of isolationism. With Castro supporting communist ideals, the USSR finally had attained a foothold a mere 90 miles away from American soil. With the new and young Cuba developing, Cuba became economically dependent on the USSR for goods and services. Not wanting to lose a foothold in the Western Hemisphere and to protect their investment, the Soviets planned to militarize Cuba. Soviet plans included reinforcement of several weapons, most notably 172 nuclear warheads. Alert levels of American forces worldwide rose from DEFCON 5 to DEFCON 3. The Air Force hands over the first of 15 nuclear ballistic missiles to the Turkish Air Force. October 27th, an American U-2 reconnaissance plane was shot down over Cuba. U.S. invasion force was readied in Florida. Peace talks. October 28th, Khrushchev issued a public statement in which Soviet missiles would be dismantled and removed from Cuba, if and only if the United States pledged not to invade Cuba and to lift the quarantine. Both Kennedy and Khrushchev agreed to the terms and the crisis was over. It is later learned that as a side negotiation, Kennedy agreed to remove the missiles from Turkey, which he did in 1963. The quarantine was lifted, but the embargo on the island of Cuba was there to stay. A blockade around Cuba is proposed along with surveillance procedures. How did the combined failure of the Bay of Pigs invasion and revelation of Soviet arms in Cuba make Cuba feel?
Well, Castro's a very smart man and used it to his advantage. I mean, he understands Americans probably better than America does. Or he did. He's an old guy and his day is over. But he used it to his advantage to keep that animosity going. I think it was a ploy to keep Cuban exiles invested in the Cold War, to keep the Cold War going longer than it needed to be in this country. I think a lot of people in Cuba suffered greatly. Cuba's like the breadbasket of the Caribbean, and there are people there that get one chicken a month and a pound of dried beans. One of the reasons that exiled Cubans don't like to visit family in Cuba when they can is because they know they're bankrupting their families, because Cubans love to have parties and big dinners and entertain people. And nothing is too much for you, and they don't have the resources to do that there. So when you go visit, they know that people are going to, spend their last dime, eat themselves out of house and home, cook themselves out of house and home to feed you. So when people go visit in Cuba, they often find ways like, I brought you a book, and there's like a $20 bill every other page in it, trying to help people over there. And that's been a big business, sending medicines, sending supplies. There's a lot of businesses in Miami about getting goods to family in Cuba. And a lot of people don't like that because they think that's supporting Castro, as opposed to let him starve, then they'll really get rid of him. That animosity among factions is still very strong in Miami. I mean, there were bombs maybe 2 years ago.
The U.S. first began its sanctions against Cuba in 1960, and it's the second oldest embargo that the U.S. is still upholding. The embargo is a very complex position that involved many triggers to push us to a full military blockade, which began between March and September of 1962. These reasons included to overthrow Castro, contain the Cuban Revolution, break Soviet-Cuban ties, demonstrate U.S. opposition against the communist regime, retaliation for the seizure of U.S. properties held in Cuba, and change the political stance of Cuba. The embargo spanned not only many years, but also multiple presidents as well. The blockade still persists to this day, including restrictions on imports from Cuba and the U.S., exports to Cuba such as food, clothes, and shoes. With the ban on these items to Cuba, Castro is forced to enact ration systems for his people. What do you think regarding recent Cuban-American relations?
So this is going to change things. Obama lifting the embargo and taking Cuba off the list of terrorist nations.